So welcome to the FPE Roundtable discussion for the Reimagining the ICC Performance Code research project. As you've been made aware, the aim of the project is to really see what the state of the situation is with perceptions and acceptance of performance-based building codes, particularly in the US, but more broadly as well, and to see what the state of performance-based design is in different disciplines and how different disciplines view their status, but also how the enforcement regulatory community views performance and performance-based approaches. And so I've provided background materials, so we don't have to go through that. I have some material handy if needed, but it's not intended to be a presentation on my part. And in fact, most of the discussion I am hoping comes from you to talk about some of the big picture issues around performance codes and performance codes for fire and where you think the discipline is. So with that, I'm Brian Meacham. I'm running this project for the International Code Council as an independent contractor. And I've been working in the performance realm for 35 years or so, both in fire, but also advising governments and working on codes and standards panels for performance-based regulatory issues. And so that's me. I'll kind of go around the room now and ask each of you to introduce yourself and maybe say a bit about why you're here today. So I'll kick off with Eric.
Sorry guys, Eric Mail, I had to get unmuted. I'm a fire protection engineer, Maryland grad. I have a strong background in firefighting. I was a fireman in DC for 15 years. Started out with Carl at Shermer and have been doing fire protection and code consulting ever since at various agencies. Now I'm out on my own with this at a small consulting firm here in DC, and have been active or been interested and active in performance-based design, you know, since SFPE came out with its first design guide. I was part of that group. I was part of the group that taught the pilot program, performance-based design for code enforcement people through NFA years ago, and have been dabbling in it ever since. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Armin.
Oh, thank you. My name is Armin Wolsky. I'm a licensed fire protection engineer out in California, work for REX Engineering, and let me see, about 25 years experience in that, in the arena of fire, life safety and fire protection. I wrote my master's thesis on the subject of risk and how that affects regulations, including performance-based codes, as well as perception of risk. So I've had interest going back to the first performance-based code conference, and I've presented at several of them.
Thank you. Mark Hopkins.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark Hopkins. I'm a Maryland grad as well, both bachelor's and master's. Been practicing for, I don't know, about 30 years or so. Been involved in a variety of different performance-based applications, and I'm currently involved in the development of the SFPE performance-based standard, which is taking the guide and moving it into a standard. So it's been an uphill process, but I chaired the analysis task group and was interim chair for the objectives task group. Also participated in hazards, scope, and I believe construction. So certainly something I've heavily involved with. And from the iCodes perspective, I've gotten some feedback recently from some other engineers that it's a little bit clunky in its application. So I'm glad to hear that this panel has started. So thank you.
Thank you. Craig Hofmeister.
Yes, Craig Hofmeister. I work for the Fire Consultants. A little bit different, not a Maryland grad, a WPI grad, undergrad and master's. So I've been a consulting engineer for going on 30 years, much of that focused or in the performance-based realm. Had a little bit of opportunity to help in the development of some modeling tools, share the SFPE substantiation guide on model substantiation guide, and looking forward to this process.
Great, thanks very much. Dave Stacy.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Dave Stacy, Principal of Performance-Based Fire Protection Engineering. Honored to be a part of this group and be invited. A little bit earlier in my career, I have about just under 11 years experience in the field. Worked for a larger firm previously before splitting off and starting my own. And obviously through the name, we like to focus on fire modeling and performance-based. That's the focus of our work. Like Mark, I was also on I am on the SFPE Standards Making Committee on Performance-Based Design and chaired the documentation group, which is for design brief and formal rational analysis, which are big pushes on my side, making sure the processes are done correctly and documented correctly. Yeah, my interest in this group and participating is definitely twofold. One, to make sure we're educating AHJs in the community on the utilization of performance-based design, making sure it's done appropriately and all the steps are covered. And also consistency between all the groups. Like we mentioned, we have the Standards Making Committee from the SFPE, we have this ICC group, a lot of different documents. And I think as a whole, together, we need to get all these aligned and more streamlined moving forward. So excited for the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Michael Stronggren.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks for inviting me here as well. So my name is Michael Stronggren. I'm a Chief Innovation Officer at Briab, which is a consultancy company in Sweden, one of the biggest ones in Scandinavia in risk and fire safety. So I'm a fire safety engineer from Lund University. Some 12 years ago, I worked for the national agency in Sweden who issues the building regulations, where I led a revision of the performance-based design regulations for fire safety in Sweden. Since then, I've been working with regulations and related research in the fire safety area. I'm currently involved in the development of the new performance-based design regime in Sweden, where we're doing a major revision where there's increased emphasis on letting the sector having a bigger role in the regulatory system. So we've had Brian in that project as a consultant, and I'm involved in that now as well in moving that forward. So I think it's really interesting to learn where you are, where you're heading, because I think there's a lot of common denominators. And I could also mention that I've also been on the SFPE board for 4 years with Carl and Brian, and I've been working in some international research projects as well. And regarding the current development in Sweden, I'm involved in developing the national strategy for the sector's standardization in the performance-based regulatory system, and I'm also leading work on digitalization. How can we create a system that is also ready for machine interpretable regulations and standards in a performance-based context. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Dan Nichols.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Dan Nichols. I am the Assistant Vice President for Fire Safety, ADA Accessibility, and Code Compliance for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City, New York State, and Southwest Connecticut. Our agency is commonly known to everybody as the New York City Subway System, Long Island Railroad, Metro North Railroad, Bridges and Tunnels, bus. We cover a tremendous area, and we also oversee the code compliance and fire safety for a $54 billion 5-year capital plan, which involves rehabilitation of Grand Central Terminal, East Side Access, Penn Station, Second Avenue Subway, and some other small projects that we have going on, some of our DIY projects. We have a tremendous need as our projects are generally building code based that have to interface with an infrastructure project. And there's no good line there. So a lot of the work that we see is already implicitly performance-based. But when that methodology is carried on to a rigid prescriptive-based building environment, that we don't have the flexibility that we need, but we also don't have the controls to adequately accept performance-based designs in the current framework for us to accept it as building officials, fire marshals, and so on. So many of you, I'm a fire protection engineer, by the way, so I'm a code official and a fire protection engineer. So can be challenging to understand what side of the bed I wake up sometimes in the morning, but I'm really here about the admin side. Everybody here is very appropriate to talk about the fire protection engineering and the performance design, but how it gets accepted by a code official is really where I'm here for. So I appreciate the invite, Brian.
Great, thank you. Carl Baldessara.
Hello, everybody. First, I'm happy to have been invited into this. I've been working in the building code area, codes in general, I suppose, building fire codes, since about 1975. I'm also a fire protection engineer, and I've led Shermer Engineering for 17 years as its president. I've been in this business for about, well, let's just say more than 40 years. And code development and standards development has been something I'd like to do. Having the ability to make an impact and work with others to develop our profession standards. Now, I understand, Brian, and I'm looking forward to some background explanation on what ICC intends, but I understand the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, has put forth a proposal or a goal, I should say, of moving our US codes to a performance-based rather than a prescriptive based, even though we say they're performance based today. The ICC performance code's been around a while. It's kind of got dust on my shelf here. We use it occasionally. We use it when required. Maybe what we're doing here will be equivalent to the Airlie House Conference or something like that, which kind of set the tone for high-rise building analysis and moving that technology forward. I'm looking forward to this, but I think, as others have said, we as engineers and practitioners can do this and do a great job, but we have a whole lot of infrastructure already out there in the way of how things are done, and the codes and the building officials, the fire officials, they are all used to the system that's currently in place. So that's going to be a very interesting transition if that fully transitions like in some other countries. I'm not sure if that's something that's going to be done sooner rather than later, or if even at all. But having a viable performance-based code is a very laudable goal. I'm looking forward to be part of this group. It's a good group of folks. I know very many of you. That's a good thing. And I worked together with many of you in the past. I'm looking forward to this, and I've taken too much time already.
Thanks, Carl. We'll go to our other Carl.
Yeah, good afternoon for me, everyone. My name is Carl Wallace. I'm German, as you can hear, I'm very sure. I started my career in Germany and then moved over very quickly to the UK, just because I realized that the performance-based design aspect is what I really enjoy, and UK offered a different play field. And I am working with the SFPE. I'm a chartered engineer now. I'm a fire consultant. I work for a smaller company, which I founded with 2 others. We are mainly fire safety consultants. We apply a lot of performance-based design. I work still with the Germans, developing with the German Fire Association guidance how to apply performance-based design. And here in the UK, I work a lot with the British standard, which has got, you know, good framework to apply performance-based designs. But I'm also really pleased to be here because now looking back over my career in the last 15, 16 years, I ask myself a lot of these things that Brian put in his email. You know, we've got all these tools and we've got all these guidance, but are we actually moving forward correctly? You know, and how can we make this more accessible, more common? And with SFPE, I really enjoy seeing what's happening in other countries, and I look forward to today's discussion and all the others that will follow. So thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Alex.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for the invite. My name is Alex Walia. I'm a senior research officer with the National Research Council of Canada, based here in Ottawa, Ontario. Been with the National Research Council, NRC, Construction Research Center, Fire Safety Section, for about 17 years now. My background is in mechanical engineering, thermal fluids engineering, and my area of expertise is in building fire dynamics, looking at combustibility of material, fire development, fuel loads, and also done some work in fire resistance, and then as well modeling, analytical modeling of fire behavior. Some of the major pieces of work that I've done, I think when I started, there was already quite a lot of interest in performance-based codes. And one thing that I should mention, NRC is a research organization funded by the federal government, a little bit similar to NIST, but one difference here is that the NRC is the custodian of the national model codes in Canada, National Building Code, National the Fire Code as well. So I think that gives us that opportunity to interact very closely with the code development process and undertake in research that helps to fill in various research gaps that are identified. So I've done a lot of work, particularly in the area of building fire dynamics, design fires. Some of that work was directly related to advancing the cause of filling some of the gaps that were identified in performance-based fire safety engineering. So with that, characterizing fire loads in modern buildings, there was not a lot of information at the time, so we did quite a lot of work to develop a wealth of information on fire loads in residential, commercial buildings, as well as undertaking one of the largest available full-scale experimental undertakings on characterizing fires in residential buildings. That also led to development of some analytical tools that could be used for calculating design fires. Now, one of the reasons that I'm here, in the past, I haven't been very directly involved in the development of codes, but as I mentioned, the linkage between NRC and the codes, the hosting of the National Building Code of Canada. We have recently initiated an undertaking to undertake research with a view of transitioning the National Building Code, which is currently largely prescriptive based, is an objective based format, which was introduced in 2005. So we are looking as a long-term effort, 5 to 10 years, to hopefully transition the National Building Code to embrace more performance-based compliance paths. So this is very early in the project. We started the project last year. And so in Canada, because of the way that the code development process works, it's really driven by a committee of volunteers that has been established by the National Research Council, which is called the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes. So they make most of the major decisions regarding the development of the building code. So with this project that we're undertaking, to try and identify what the research, the gaps that are required to move towards performance-based codes. The research will be in support of the Commission's efforts to undertake the work to transition the National Building Code. So we are particularly interested in the work effort that is being undertaken by the ICC, because they're ahead of us in the sense that there's already the ICC performance-based code. So we're looking to here to learn, to see. We're interested to see how the direction that the ICC is going with trying to reimagine the performance-based code, and hopefully there'll be lessons learned that will help our effort in Canada to move towards a performance-based code in the near future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, we'll go to CJ.
Hi, I'm Chris Jelenowitz. Oh, do you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Hi, I'm Chris Jelenowitz. I'm the chief engineer with the Society of Fire Protection Engineers. SFPE is currently in the development of 7 different standards and or guides that are promoting the use of performance-based design. SFPE also has a ICC working group that's trying to get the word out about performance-based design to the ICC members. We were successful in the last change of the code to get a new Appendix O in the building code on performance-based design that we hope that will help the code officials get a better understanding of performance-based design. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, everyone. I think in your introductions, we already kicked off some of the issues that we want to kick around in terms of where we're at, what some of the roadblocks are, and what we need to do to move forward. So, one of the questions that I'd like to hear from this group is, what do you think the state of readiness is of the profession of fire protection or fire safety engineers, both in the ability to undertake performance-based design, but also to conduct reviews for verifying performance of the designs, and where we sit with our current guidance in terms of performance-based design for fire. So I'll throw that out there. If you can raise your hand or flag, I'm not going to go around to everyone. It's kind of, if you want to talk, let me know. So if somebody wants to talk, we'll start with Carl Wallace.
Great. Well, I'll make a start. Here in the UK, I think for nearly 20 years, legally, the application and the use of performance-based design is being recognized as an alternative route, not the dodgy route. It's really alternative to application of prescriptive guidance, which is fantastic, right? I know that a lot of fire engineers in other countries wish for that legal system, but in a way, that's the framework. I think there's still a shortage of people and engineers to apply this properly, to apply performance-based design. Sometimes people think, oh, I'm just doing a little bit of modeling and I use performance-based design, but performance-based design can be a lot deeper. And therefore, I think there's still a shortage of people. We still got problems in the education system, I would say, to properly educate performance in the application of performance-based design. A lot will be done on the job. And then you mentioned, so one is the undertaking performance-based design, the other is reviews. In the past, we had a lot of performance-based design strategies or elements were approved by other fire engineers rather than building control or statutory authorities, purely because they did not have the knowledge. And it's still the case to some degree, but after 20 years, I'm looking around and I think I wish there would be more people able to review it, but also properly approve it. It seems not that I'm frustrated, but I started, I thought it's all there, let's apply it, but it seems to be a long way for it to become the norm, and I think we still have quite a way to go here in the UK.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I'll go, Brian. It's Dave. Yeah, I think it's very similar here in the United States. There's definitely numerous FPEs that are doing performance-based design, doing the approaches correctly. We kind of get more on the roadblock once it gets to submission. I'm sure that'll be one of the topics later, right? Accepting that approach. What's the technical background of the reviewer? And yeah, I think having that third party is a big component of that to make sure we protect the approach and the field, ensuring that these are done correctly. Because as it becomes more and more popular, I mean, we're seeing it now, more and more engineers and firms are getting involved in these approaches because they're seeing the impact that it can have on design teams and the project as a whole. So there's going to be more and more people looking to pursue it, and we need to make sure that the technical background side, they're able to do it. So yeah, it's really going to drive home the importance of mentoring and also just the review process for sure.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll take a stab. I'm thinking that there is a demand for performance-based design, and there's a supply of fire engineers for performance-based design. And in America, that's all falls under our prescriptive code for the most part. If there were a infrastructure for performance-based design, i.e. a performance-based code, it's very possible that that demand would rise and there might be insufficient engineers available to fill that gap. So there needs to be a little bit of a balance of consideration of the supply and demand. Currently, I find a lot of times on the ground projects that I work on, performance-based design approaches are not elected by building owners and developers because of the uncertainty revolving around them. If there were to be a process that was and a framework available for everybody and that everybody bought into that process and framework, that uncertainty may reduce and we may find more demand based on that coming from owners and developers.
So let me kind of jump in there, because this is, part of what I want to get to with this question is we've had in fire protection engineering in the US, a performance-based design guide since the late 1980s. But I call that a process guide. It doesn't actually tell you how to quantify design fires or what specific analyses to use, or there's no robust system like a load and resistance factor design process in the structures. So everybody who's on the design side, in this group could look at a problem and come up with a different answer. So to me, that's not a robust system, because then you're putting an undue burden on the enforcement side to make a decision on kind of what's appropriate. So many of you are involved in, SFPE's new standards development. Is that going to be addressed? Is this moving towards a robust framework that warrants the confidence in the application? And if not, why are we doing it? Any takers?
I think it's,
Brian, this is Chris.
Brian, go ahead.
We'll take CJ first, Chris.
Yeah, Brian, I think with the development of not only the new SFPE performance-based design standard, but other standards we're looking at involving things like fire exposures and fire scenarios topics. I think we are getting closer to that. I don't think we're going to be 100% there yet, but I think we will be at a better place as a result. Specifically, I think when we're looking at things like a deterministic analysis. However, to me, I really think that we really need to get to the stage where we're looking at this sort of analysis more as a probabilistic analysis. And I think that's where we still are going to need a lot more time to develop the methodologies to get us there. Some of our committees, and as we have at least 3 of those committees, are looking at these probabilistic type analysis. And I could tell you that there's going to be a lot of work to get us where we need to be.
Thank you. Carl Baldessari.
Yeah, I think it might be useful, Brian, if you could share with us the goal of the project as identified by ICC that was given to you. Background and objectives and expectations on the part of the ICC about this project.
Sure. I'll do that briefly. I sent out a lot of materials as background so we wouldn't have to use a lot of time in the discussion.
Right.
But fundamentally, it's been 20 years since the ICC Performance Code for Buildings and Facilities was developed. A lot has happened over the last 20 years in terms of, advancements in performance regulation and design internationally, but also here in the US. If you go back to the 20 years ago when the ICCPC was developed, there was no concept of sustainability. There was no concept of resilience. Energy performance wasn't in there, indoor air quality. So it was built largely around, what was state of the art at the time for structural design, leaning heavily on earthquake engineering and performance-based design for fire, which was just at its early stages. And so even though there's been code changes over time, there hasn't been, any radical change nor any radical uptake of the ICCPC. So the intent of this effort is to, in the first instance, find out what the current, state of readiness is within the market. Is the market ready for this from the design side as architects, from the engineering disciplines, from the enforcement side? And if so, what should it look like? How do we get everybody on the same page with terminology? What's the right level of, design competency that's needed? What types of documents are needed to support the review process? Where are investments needed in education and training? And kind of develop a roadmap. This is not a code development activity. And, frankly, it'll be up to ICC after this if they think it's, worth going to. But as you mentioned, Carl, the AIA has already set out an objective to, try to move architects more towards performance, based design by 2030, and they would like to see a performance code. But I think before we can even start the journey of a code development, we have to get everybody on the same page. And I can tell you an energy engineer views performance different than a structural engineer, different than a fire engineer. And, that makes it hard for a building official who is looking at energy, fire, structure, noise, indoor air quality, and all the rest. So phase one, and what we're trying to do here is, all right, where are fire safety engineers? Are we at a point where we think we can do robust performance-based designs? And if so, what does that mean? How would we set or recommend a regulatory structure within which that can work? And what tools do we need both for designers, but for enforcement officials to be able to actually work within such an environment? So we're at the research and information gathering phase with the hope, at least personally, to see document development in the future, but that's not within the scope of this particular effort. So Dan, you've had your hand up for a while. We'll jump over to you.
Sure. You kind of just teed me right up where I needed to be. So thank you. As a fire protection engineer going to school, you learn all about the fire safety stuff, and then you go into the code world and you realize there's 30 other chapters and 7 other books you got to worry about. In preparing for this meeting, I thought to myself, as a code official, when there's a complex structural design, a whole bunch of really smart engineers get together and create a whole bunch of documents that they stamp and sign, and they send it in. And it's fine. Energy evaluation, it's fine. But then you get to the corridor design and we sit there and fight for weeks on end about whether it's a 20 or 45-minute door. And nobody can tell me the difference why it's a 20 or 45-minute door. We have gotten so prescriptive based on such archaic assumptions in the fire safety world that I think that the reason why performance-based design is so challenging in the fire safety world is that we haven't redefined the codes to what we do today. Every code official wants to start somewhere. They want to open a book and say, okay, this roof and this 55-foot tall warehouse needs to be 2-hour rated, but if it's over 20 feet, it doesn't have to be rated. Where'd that number come from? Why are we worrying about that? And then somebody comes in and wants to do a performance-based design to change it out. And the pieces are not readily available like in the other disciplines as the assumptions. The answer why? Because fire is not as predictable as snow loading or wind loading or earthquake loading. So we have to fix the input, I think, before we start to really consider acceptability of the output to those that regulate buildings. So if you're asking me where my focus is, we need to get stuck off of the old prescriptive ways in fire safety like the other disciplines have to move this forward. So I think that's the readiness at the current time of the profession.
You're speaking to the demand side of that Brian mentioned before.
Yes. Yes.
So Mark, I see you have your hand up. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. So as you identified the interaction with the other disciplines, it really tied in with some of the statements made by Steve Kerber in his keynote address at the SFPE conference this week. And there are other opportunities here, right? The energy code has changed how insulation is being applied to the exterior of buildings, and that introduces opportunities to compromise fire protection And, there's, so I think that, looking at buildings from a performance perspective, I think any guidance that can be provided to both users and reviewers to look at those other areas and to consider the whole performance rather than being in an isolated box, just looking at their own individual discipline would be extremely helpful. But the other point I want to make is, we're at a point where there's a lot of very good data that is being collected that then feeds into better opportunities for improving the analysis methods and the calculations that we're using and relying on. The other area that currently seeing a lot of development is with energy storage systems, which may not be a typical office building, but certainly something that's being introduced into other occupancies and other structures. And again, it's just, I think we have some other opportunities here. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe I'll take this opportunity to, be maybe a little controversial or try to stir things up a bit, but we seem to spend an awful lot of time, collecting data, maybe to help enhance models, but I'm not so sure we really know what problems we're trying to solve and how well the models and the data do in solving the problems. And I don't think we communicate very well, how we're applying those data tools and methods to solving the actual building performance fire challenges. So I don't know if anybody agrees with that, but, that's a big part of this, perception, I think, of, are we able to do performance-based design? Because it's not clear that, every other discipline, thinks we are, because we're not really too coordinated in how we do it. Does anybody share that view, or do you think I'm off base? Eric.
Thank you very much. So I had just finished jotting down some notes right before you started, and the first thing I was going to say is, without clearly defined goals of what the existing building code has, what the current ICC documents have outside performance-based design, we run into problems with AHJs all the time. I was in a meeting one time when the code official said to me, well, I need a back door to the building because what happens if a gasoline tanker runs into the front door? And I was like, I don't think the code really protects against that. And there was, they absolutely do. And so there's a whole argument of, I fully agree, until we can clearly identify the goals of the current scope of codes, it's very hard to implement with the AHJs and get them to buy off, especially when they don't come from a technical background. When they come from a contractor background or construction background, or from the fire service, and don't have engineering degrees or architecture degrees, they view the IBC as written on high, and any deviation from the IBC is a way to get around the code, not provide an equal level of facilitation. And not every code official is there, but I think we've all of us that consult see that all the time. And back to your original question of, are the FPEs ready for this? I think most of the higher level ones are. There are certainly guys that are functioning out there that can't do it, haven't done it right. But I think there's enough of us out there that can handle it. Can the AHJs and the architects handle it? I think the architects desperately want it because they don't want to be constrained by the prescriptive requirements of dead ends and corridor ratings and the way atriums are looked at today. They want to be released from all that stuff. The problem is the AHJs still are saying, well, you have a performance-based design, but your dead end's longer than the prescriptive requirement. You can't do that. That's not an equivalent level of safety. They don't understand what we're doing. That's the biggest impediment.
Thanks for that.
Someday.
And Dan, Nichols has dropped off, so he can't defend the code official's perspective.
I
But
spend half my life doing plan review on behalf of jurisdictions. So I'm half code official, half code consultant. So trust me, I understand the issue, but I think Dan is one of the ones that can do it right and is begging for these things.
yeah, and I think he's not alone. And I think part of the challenge is that there's a, you know, as you said, and he said as well, we're stuck in a prescriptive mindset that has to be overcome. But, you know, even the ICC performance code in its current iteration lays out, you know, the performance objectives, functional expectations, and provides, or had intended to provide, you know, that unifying set of what are the fundamental, you know, goals, functional objectives, and performance requirements we have in buildings. And if we haven't done that well enough, you know, what are we aiming for in fire safety in buildings? Can't we describe, you know, whether or not the current hierarchy is appropriate or not, but even qualitatively in a clear way, what do we expect out of fire safety in buildings? If we can't do that, how can we expect anyone else to actually make that decision as to whether we're on target or not?
I think every time we do a performance-based design or sit down and create a alternative compliance method or code modification, we are doing that. And I think that those of us in this meeting and most fire protection engineers think they can identify that and create and convey that in a reasonable manner to the design team and to AHJs that are willing to listen. But I think that there's an uncomfort level of, hey, we haven't done this before. It seems like hocus pocus. I don't have the technical expertise to understand what happens in your black box of a model. And there isn't someplace I can look and say, well, okay, if I'm not intimate with ignition, then I'm not allowed to die. And if I'm intimate with ignition, I'm allowed to die, or something almost as black and white as that. And I know that I saw a couple cringes as I said that, but the truth of the matter is, it's going to take something to that basic level until we get AHJs that are engineers and architects.
Okay, I see Mark's got his hand up.
Thank you. Well, there's another piece to this, and you know, oftentimes we are dealing with AHJs that may not be as well educated or whatnot, but they have the opportunity for third-party reviews. And that's where I think a lot of us have probably been pulled in to review the work of another, you know, another firm, or have had our work reviewed by someone else. And but I think, you know, at the basic level, we're still dealing with AHJs that can't handle prescriptive requirements. So now pulling them into performance-based requirements introduces you know, a lot more opportunities that where they're misinterpreting or misunderstanding the requirements to begin with. You know, so I think, you know, pulling in that third-party review aspect may be advantageous for us. But I think at some point we're probably going to be dealing with the situation where we've got more demand than engineers to do the work.
So I have Dave, Stacy, and then Carl Wallace.
Yeah, just adding to the AHJ discussion, and I don't want to make it seem like we're bashing them and their knowledge, but I have the two instances where I have run into issues. Is one, they don't want to take ownership of that. They feel like there's liability, and honestly, me personally, I don't know the extent of liability they do have by accepting these approaches. I think they do carry some of that. I know in our reports, you know, outside of like an atrium smoke control, but a true performance-based design, we do request the building code official signature and the fire department official signature on acceptance of that approach. So the two times I've had most trouble with getting an approach through is they will not take ownership of it, sometimes even to the extent of going up to the state fire marshal's office for their consultation. So that's one issue. And yeah, that's the second one is through training and understanding the approach. The other time we haven't had success is when they say, well, it's great, you did this analysis, but you still didn't give us something in exchange, right? They actually want to see something in addition that's above and beyond the code. So although a performance-based approach may say, yeah, you don't need to provide spray applied fireproof into this exposed steel, but you didn't give us anything else, where anything else was the analysis saying it's okay, but they want even more on top of it. So education issue, as well as just taking ownership, are two issues as well on the AHJ side.
Yeah, and before I go to Carl Wallace, I think I would generally, maybe characterize that as communication. I think we have to, education for everybody, but better communication, I think, is a big aspect too. Carl.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on two things. One is that we all seem to be completely aligned. We're all, fans of performance-based design. And one of your questions, Brian, was, we have data, are we using that correctly, and are we coordinated? And I had a discussion with someone recently and explaining them what my day-to-day work is, yeah? And I said to them, fantastic, I move away. It doesn't matter where my building is, in England, in Wales, Scotland, US, wherever. I apply real physics and chemistry and the real engineering behind it. And my solution will be building specific, but moves away from prescriptive guidance. And then discussion went on, and we talked about COVID, what we all were facing with. And an interesting thought came up. The whole world was faced with the same problem. The whole world, every country had their experts, and they had pretty much the same knowledge, the same data, but every country came up with a different solution how to deal with this. And I think, are we actually properly coordinated? If we are here in this virtual room, if we all would given a problem, a building, how would we all say, yeah, fantastic, I've done the same approach, the solution, or would we actually start to argue with each other and say, no, actually, you forgot this and I've got the better solution and so on? It's just the thought of, are we actually all aligned, and how are we actually dealing with performance-based design on a day-to-day basis? That was just a thought.
No, and it's a good point. And, we can look at the Dalmarnock test to show how out of alignment, engineers can be, even with the same data sets, and choice of modeling tools on a simple problem. So conceptually, and this was kind of my point, before with the performance-based design guide as a process guide, everybody can interpret it differently in terms of the parts that matter to getting to a solution. And it doesn't actually tell us, how to determine what are the objectives we should be aiming for in the beginning. So you may do a very good solution, but it may be solving the wrong problem. So I think there's, a lot of that issue that we haven't collectively as a profession, but also in working with other disciplines, actually figured out what it is we're trying to do. And, I think Dan and other, people have already commented, it's easy to fall back on the prescriptive because it's comfortable. But if we're falling back to where it's comfortable, it's really hard to kind of move forward. So I think discussion is good. Armin, did you have something?
Yes, it kind of sounds a little bit like one direction.
Did they break for lunch yet?
Sorry. Okay.
I think that was CJ. Sorry about that.
Okay. One thing that I think I'm hearing, and that is something that I think maybe Canada was involved with. What I'm hearing is we don't know what the code says. Currently, when we do performance-based design in the US, it's often on a piecemeal basis. I'm sure most people would agree with me. We look at a particular section of the code. Then we argue about, as Dan, I think it said 20 minutes versus 45-minute doors. And so getting back to this idea of where this comes, where do these requirements come from, makes me think of what I think Canada did, is give every code section an objective to meet, so that everybody is in agreement. Okay, if we're doing this piecemeal performance-based design approach instead of doing a whole performance-based code system, that could be or would be one way of going. So I think Alex is from Canada. If Alex could chime in on that, and that if that in fact occurred, what happened? Did it fail? Is it in process?
I don't know, Alex, if you're still with us.
Yes, I am. I was just I was muted there.
Okay.
That's why. Yeah, I think with regards to the Canadian National Building Code, as far as I'm aware, the major change that occurred with the objective-based introduction of objective-based code in 2005 was that the acceptable solutions are linked to at least one of the code objectives and functional statements. But there's still, I think, challenges in addressing innovative new designs via the alternative solutions route. So I think that's something that is inspiring this new undertaking that we're on to try and do further research to broaden the acceptance paths to be more performance-based.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And I think a
Brian?
lot of, yep.
Hey, I want to go back to two things real quick. One related to Dan Nichols' comment. When SFPE tried to get this Appendix O put into the International Building Code, one of the issues that I saw was that I would think half the people in the room at the code hearings didn't really have a good feeling or a good handle of what performance-based design was. And so when we want to talk about changing codes and things like that, well, when people don't really understand the fundamentals of what exactly performance-based design is, it really makes it difficult. The second comment I wanted to add on things that went by is related to data. And you, Brian, you brought that up as, the whole thing about data. And it seems like, any discussion about performance-based design, people say, we don't have data, but I think it's more complex than that, right? I think there are areas where we don't have data to do some things, but at the same time, do we really have a roadmap of how we should be obtaining this new data? What data do we really need, and what are those gaps? It seems like throughout the world it's kind of willy-nilly. I know at SFP we tried to narrow that down a bit with a research roadmap and things like that, but still, it seems like our whole profession is that whatever the research community is doing research on, and that might not be the best stuff that we need for a fire protection engineer.
Thanks for that, Chris. That kind of fits to a presentation I've made a couple of times about the evolution of an engineering discipline, where in the beginning research is being done for research's sake and not necessarily in response to the needs of the profession. But to advance, the profession has to say what it needs. And I think there's been some comments, and I think, Chris, you were one of them, that moving towards more probabilistic type of design seems to make sense. And if you look at structural engineering, it's in that realm. And one of the reasons it works is because everybody recognizes that you can't control when an earthquake is going to happen, for example, and you don't necessarily know exact forces that are going to be on the building. But if you can draw a distribution around what the intensity is going to be, then you have a sense of what your resistance to that intensity needs to be to reach your objectives. And, I fundamentally struggle with why we think fire is different. We don't know the exact fire that's going to be in a building. but there's probably a distribution of fires that could occur under different conditions that we should be thinking about. And there's a distribution in responses, whether it's people or the structure. But we haven't made any substantial progress in that area, as a framework way of thinking. And it seems, difficult, for example, to have a discussion with structural engineers about performance when they're probabilistic and we're in this deterministic realm that, doesn't even deal with the uncertainty and variability in a meaningful way. So just kind of my, bias, sorry to introduce that, but I think that's a big challenge. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. The whole idea of the objectives is key, because if you state, and I think you said it earlier, Brian, but if you state the objectives incorrectly, you're solving the wrong problem. I know of a museum, so large assembly space, and performance-based design was used to justify elimination of a fire detection system, a fire alarm system, and sprinkler protection in a fairly large structure. So now that to me is sort of moving away from, some of the tools that have been proven to be effective in saving lives and protecting property. And the jurisdiction accepted the concept, and the insurance carrier stepped in, and I was informed of this scenario from a personal friend that is in the insurance industry. So there's a case where the objectives were laid out, and probably not in a way that really looks out for the best interest of the public, and that at the basic level is what we're all really supposed to be doing, right? Looking out for people from a fire and life safety standpoint. So understanding the objectives is key. The other comment I wanted to make is that, moving back to prescriptive requirements is an area of safety, but it's also a presumed area of consensus, and where different stakeholders have had the opportunity to weigh in. And I know CJ identified that most people probably don't even understand what performance-based design is. But and I agree with that. There's skepticism and there's some fear there because of the lack of understanding. And in general terms, most of the time, if there's a lack of understanding, the default answer is no, I disagree. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we only have about 20 minutes left. So I want to make sure I get other people in. Alex, did you have a comment? Or was somebody else? Somebody else was jumping in, CJ?
Sorry, that was Craig.
Craig, yes, good.
Yeah. I'm just gonna follow up on some. Sorry, I'm in my car, so I'm not able to kind of raise my hand. Follow up on kind of a roadblock, or at least a speed bump in moving forward. And we've talked about it is whether it's a consensus acceptable level of risk or an individual acceptable level of risk. I think we've talked around it several times here, but we're doing in the US performance-based design on particular features. We're not really broadening this out to the whole building. And so when we get there, we end up needing to be so
Breaking up a bit, Craig, just to let you know.
For any number of reasons, by the HJ or for your own liability or how that ends up being, but sorry. So just when we're doing a performance-based design, it's our criteria. And so if we refine that based on probability or whatever that might be.
So thanks, Craig. You were in and out of coverage, but I think, I might interpret what you said as, we're not really tackling, the societal objective, thinking about this tolerable risk issue and looking at what a fundamental benchmark or criteria might be that could be across disciplines, but would really drive, what the fire safety design might be and would be compared against, or something to that effect. And I think even if I have that wrong, your comment and your lead in was, good in terms of roadblocks, because as we kind of, with about 20 minutes remaining, I want to give people a chance to kind of jump in with, what are one or two critical issues that we have to overcome going forward to really get over this hump of, can we do performance and how do we get there? And, what really are the 6 things that we have to do for success? So some things you have to do to overcome a challenge. The other things maybe are what you really need to do good, successful performance-based design. And if they're the same, that's fine, but they might be different. So Eric, you have your hand up. We'll let you comment and then maybe tackle those questions too.
I'm getting unmuted. Thank you. I was working it. So my comment was something you said earlier, and I'm going to assume I misunderstood it because it doesn't seem right. And I thought I heard you say something to the effect of that we have different engineers coming to different conclusions on a performance-based design. And I kind of think that's the intent of performance-based design, is that the solution to the problem, if you've got 2 competent engineers, can be completely different, but the goals and objectives are still met. So did I misunderstand you? Because I thought you said you wanted consistency in the output.
If the question's to me, I think, what we're trying to do is we should have a consistent target to aim for. For example, a level of safety, a level of risk, a level of performance. If 10 different engineers come up with 10 different designs and the outcome of those 10 different designs results in different levels of safety, then how can we say, we've achieved it? And if anybody is saying their design guarantees 100% safety, I wouldn't accept that design. So I don't think we're at a point where, we can achieve from 10 different people, that outcome with different approaches without knowing what the target is. And we don't have a well-defined target.
I agree we don't have a well-defined target. I think that goes back to my earlier statement that the goals of the existing prescriptive code aren't laid out in a manner that we understand it. We all know that at 1.101 basically said, hey, we're protecting against one accidental fire in the building. We're not at a one fire event. It's not an arson event. And that was the kind of the basis of starting with 101. But we don't have that same, I think that's kind of fallen away. I don't think we have that same thing for any of the ICC documents, or at least within the IBC. And there's certainly a huge difference within AHJs of what the goals are. And so I would agree with you that until we define the goals, we're going to get a whole bunch of people hitting a different level of safety because they're not clearly defined. That's our number one issue, I think. I think 2 is AHJ training or the use of outside experts, third parties, however you want to look at it.
Great, thank you. And I think, particularly around the goals and objectives, that's something proactively the discipline can do to try to define, as well as offer education. Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you just hit it. I think, that what we're dealing with most of the building codes is reactionary, right? There is some incident that drives change. And now here we are trying to get into the mindset of being proactive, and we're designing a buildings from a true performance perspective. And I think there needs to be a paradigm shift to really get full buy-in on performance-based designs.
Great. Carl, Baldessara, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I'm not so, I think we're gonna, I don't know, it's kind of hard to say, but I think unless we write this down as part of the solution, which I think is going to be difficult or impossible to do, when having a performance-based design and going into an AHJ, I may negotiate a performance level that somebody else will have a different level. Is it the intention that the guide specify a minimum performance and a minimum acceptable performance for a given scenario or for a given design or a given an assembly structure or a residential structure? We need to have flexibility as design professionals, and yet there's a minimum standard of an acceptance, of course, but I think that relies on professional training and ethics. But I think it's going to be difficult. We were talking about, well, I think you mentioned, Brian, we shouldn't have different outcomes, but I think we can, and I think they can still be acceptable and different by different professionals. Did I miss something?
Well, I think as with many things, it's interpretation, and I would go back to, regardless of whether you're in a prescriptive or a performance, the code is intended to establish the minimum tolerable level, right? So arguably the IBC does it, through a lot of prescriptions, but it should be the tolerable level of performance or the minimum tolerable level of risk. If we can't identify what that means, I mean, I'll look at earthquake engineering, for example. There's no one that really believes that for a design event that's larger than the maximum considered earthquake, that the building's going to survive or every person will live. There's an inherent understanding that you're designing for a certain level of risk given a defined magnitude of design earthquake, and the building's expected to perform. If we can't get people in the fire side to agree whether it's a 1 megawatt, 10 megawatt, or 100 megawatt fire, and you're saving everyone 1% or 10% or 90% of the people, we're never going to get there. And I think you can get multiple solutions to the problem, but if you can't define the performance you're expecting in a way that everybody can understand, then we're lost. So that's the differentiation I make. I got Dave, Stacy, and then Carl Wallace. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, this is going to be a topic that I think we'll go back and forth on for a long time. Even with the, I'll put some insight on the SFPE committee, standards making committee for PVD. This was obviously talked about a lot, and even that document is not going to explicitly say for a sports arena utilize a 10 megawatt fire in the center of the space. We talked about it quite a bit, and I wasn't on that subgroup, so if someone else here was, they could comment on it as well. But there will be some examples in appendix material, and there will be guidance on how we get to those. But as we know, right, every project, every goal, every analysis is different, and that's the difficulty with directly, especially in the ICC document, saying visibility will be assessed at 10 meters. Well, is that the case in every single one, or do we want to provide that lenience? But to your point, there is at some point there needs to be a stance to provide guidance and how we accept those. But I think it's going to be a discussion that is ongoing throughout its eternity to figure this out and how we're going to do it. But the stance on the SFPE committee, as far as I could tell, is it's still going to be up, a lot to the performing engineers and justification. But to that point, what is the performance metric? What is the goal? The framework that committee is proposing is definitely very clearly defined with how we do that, how that looks, what the stakeholders' engagement is. and agreeing on that before the analysis, right? So I think there's some safeties in place, but there's not going to be a definitive, this is what you do every time.
Thank you. So I had Carl, then I'll go up to Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I find this discussion really interesting. And I've got another example, maybe outside of the building industry. If all of us would be tasked to define, for a new country that doesn't exist, and they want to design roads on the countryside, in town, motorway, etc., and they ask us for the perfect speed limit, we all might come up with different answers because we all have got different experience. Yeah, we might drive different cars. The roads might be designed differently where we are used to narrow environment, wide, etc. So the first initial answer would be probably very different. But if there's a guidance in a way to tell us, well, you can actually calculate the perfect speed limit based on the road surface, the car, the width of the car, the street, whatever is there, then maybe we all would have a guidance, a toolbox to come up with the right answer that, despite our differences that we bring to the table and our upbringing, in a way, our cultural upbringing, we could logically agree on one value. And in a way, that, I guess, is what you mean, Brian. If there is something, if we could just have a path how to agree on where do we want to end up, or what are the rules to come to the answer that we all agree. I mean, that would be ideal, but I think it would be very, very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And maybe I'll, take executive privilege to take that analogy a step further. I think, around the world, and different countries have different limits, but there's a performance specification for vehicles. The car must be able to stop when going a speed of X kilometers per hour within a certain number of meters, and has a certain crash performance when going at a certain speed into a wall. Those are the performance metrics that we need for buildings, from which the policymakers can say an acceptable speed limit given the performance of the vehicle is X. We're trying to get a roadmap to building performance without having the discipline define how the building should perform. So we don't have the building performance safety measures defined like you have for a vehicle. And there's a lot of vehicles, from a Tesla to a Ferrari to a whatever, in terms of capabilities, but they're all expected to perform the same in terms of safety. We can't and haven't yet defined the safety performance for fire in buildings. So getting to the point of the speed limit analogy, we've got a long way to go. So a few other people that haven't weighed in on this last part, Armin?
Yeah, that made me think of something that other people have brought up, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, is the idea of defining the problem as we know it in terms of, in our current system, at least in the US, we're right now stuck with, well, we've inherited a prescriptive based system. And speaking of which you were just talking to, is what is the performance? Well, what is the performance of a current system? We don't know what that is, or at least I'm throwing that out as a thought. And perhaps it's important as part of this roadmap to understand that, or to understand it better, if you will.
Yep, good, thank you. Mark?
Yep, thank you. I just wanted to go back to Dave Stacy's point. There was a lot of discussion on the PVD committee about criteria and acceptable levels. And to be honest, SFP did a really good job in assembling the committee, because there's representation from a number of different countries, and the level of tolerance or level of risk established by each of these different countries is vastly different. So going back to that, single point may not always be applicable. We can't even do that in the US, right? If I've got a remote structure in the middle of Alaska that has access issues, I'm going to be looking at the performance differently than if that same building was in downtown New York City, right? So you have different resources, different expectations that surround the building, but it's also regionally. You know, if you're subject to hurricanes and not earthquakes, do you really need to include provisions for earthquakes? You know, so I think to some extent it's difficult to identify all of the basic parameters. So the position of that particular committee will likely be to give some guidance in terms of how to select the criteria, and then provide resources for where you can find the criteria, and then allow the user to make those appropriate determinations.
Thank you. Craig, not sure how your cell reception is, but do you have any last comments or perspectives to add?
I'll give it a go. Let me know if it's not working and I'll stop.
Sounds good.
But you know what, this strikes me just as a kind of another analogy a little bit is, you know, the SFP performance-based conference did case studies and has done case studies for a lot of years, in which, you know, different countries tackled the same problem. And what was interesting, you know, early on and even continuing was most of the US countries went right to deterministic modeling and those type of approaches. Many of the European countries went to a statistical and probability analysis. And so then we started looking at that and saying, well, what does this really mean? They were great presentations, but are we coming up with the same answers or the same outcomes, I guess? And so how can we evaluate that? To me, I think that question still is valid. Can we meld those two methods together to come up with a better answer, so that if we are using a deterministic, a modeling, a performance-based approach, the end goal is similar in terms of what's the acceptable level of risk to probabilistic analysis.
Okay, all good points. Thank you. We haven't heard much from Michael Stronggren. If you're still with us, do you have anything to add before we close out for today?
Yeah, sorry for being quiet here. Had some things with the family in the background. Well, one comment, I think I heard some comparisons with structural engineering, and there was a study in Sweden on structural side, and we've done this analogy quite a few times, since it's structural engineering is also dealing with accidental loads and so on. And we know that even though structural engineering is a quite well, maybe a more mature field, we know that there's also uncertainties in that field. And in a round robin study, there was shown that there was a quite big variation among structural engineers when doing calculations. But in that study, they also saw that, well, even though there was a big variations in how they calculated loads, they still ended up with acceptable solutions according to the code. So I think it's acceptable to have a variation when you ask different engineers, and that we may have we may have different ways of dealing or approaching a certain objective, and we may have to accept that also in our field, but we need to find ways to gain the confidence that we are on the safe side, regardless of what engineer who does the study. So I think that's the main point here, that we need these mechanisms of confidence in the system, even though there will be variation when we deal with performance-based design. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Alex, did you have anything more to add at the end here?
Yes, well, it's a very interesting discussion, particularly when talking about variability of input parameters that could lead to different outcomes. I believe that's, I think, where also it becomes important, I think, to do the research to try and sort of have some uniformity in terms of what are the appropriate type of input parameters that should be done. I think that's important in a performance-based environment, as well as the tools, methods, means of verification that are applied. I think that goes towards narrowing down the variability of the output from different design approaches. And I think from the project that we're undertaking in Canada, one of the other things that we're trying to do is we're trying to do further analysis of the prescriptive acceptable solutions in the current National Building Code, and try to see if we could perhaps try to ascribe some sort of performance measures that can be deciphered from there, and where it's not possible, identify research that could be done to develop the information that will help to quantify performance. Because those, I think, becomes the minimum sort of performance criteria that, you know, any performance-based design could also be, the solution that you obtain from a performance-based design has to be at least proved to be over and above what that a measure, the baseline measure is. Great. So that's all I had to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else before we call it this session to a close?
I just want to add that to Alex's, there's nothing that keeps us from thinking about that approach as an interim stop on this road to ultimately a new performance-based code that's a little more encompassing.
Yeah, great. That's
And
good.
one last thing from Eric, if I could.
Yep.
I think that maybe what needs to be defined is more of the types of scenarios that need to be addressed within the performance-based design. In other words, the performance-based design has to address accidental fires within the building, has to address exposure fires, has to address spontaneous evacuation of all occupants at the same time, or something, or very broad things like that, without exactly saying we have to be able to defend against a 1 megawatt fire or a 5 megawatt fire, because that's going to change dramatically depending on where you are and what's happening. And I think that's something that should be left up to the design team and the stakeholders. But the types of events that we have to protect against, I think that is what needs to be within the code document of telling us, hey, look at these things, and if you can figure out a way to quantify these things and operate safely when those things happen, then you've got an appropriate building.
I think don't you already find that, Eric, in 101 and the various scenarios that are identified?
I think 101 has it, but I don't think ICC has it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge problem, that when I go to a code official, they say, well, how did you pick this scenario and why didn't you pick this larger one? Or what happens if I have an active shooter in the building? How have you dealt with egress in that event?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
No, I think those are all good points, getting back to those big picture goals and objectives and the scenarios that would be needed to test them. So I think with that, we'll call this session to a close. I'd like to thank you all for engaging discussion. I'd also like an indication in whether you guys would be interested to meet again to continue discussion, maybe tackle some of the objectives, acceptable risk issues, some of the technical details, and diving into that part of it. If there's a lot of nodding yes, so we'll try to queue one of those up down the road a little bit. And appreciate
Brian,
this.
Do you envision this as sort of a continuing working group, or is this just were you looking just to touch base?
Well, my intent is, I want to have a couple of roundtables with each of the different groups to kind of get a sense of where the disciplines are at, kind of see where we're at in terms of how close or how far apart we are as disciplines, as engineers versus enforcement officials, architects, and others, and then bring folks together in a workshop environment. And depending on, probably still in the COVID environment, but maybe a couple of sessions over a couple of weeks where, one half-day session, lay out the issues, lay out the commonalities and the challenges we're aiming for, put people into groups, and then send them away for a couple of weeks to try to work amongst themselves virtually, like we would typically do in a workshop, and then come back together and see where we're at. So, this research phase will go a few more months, then it'll be kind of up to ICC how they want to continue. But my suggestion is that so far the roundtable groups have all been really engaged in bringing a lot to the process. I would encourage ICC to continue, regardless of how they go, to keep these discussions moving. Okay. So with that, thank you very much. I'll be in touch on next steps, and not too far in the future, we'll be posting these. So you might find it interesting to look at what the other roundtables have to say as well. So thank you all.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Brian.